The Rolex GMT, a watch that has become legend. Along with the likes of the Datejust, Submariner and the Daytona, the GMT has become and remains a flagship for the family. The simple history behind the model can be found everywhere, but the question we have to ask is whether or not the direction for this watch was the right direction when it was first conceived in the 1950s. Both the Submariner and the GMT models were based on the turnograph. Where the Submariner was a watch intended for its excursions in the sea, the GMT was devised as a more formal watch to be used by the jet setter. Now, undoubtedly, the way that both of these models adopted the same format, the same turning bezel, was brilliant. How the GMT complication evolved another hour hand that could be used in tandem with the bezel to help tell time in different time zones was genius. But that said, if Rolex had the technology at the time, like they do right now, would they have not tried something else? That is the underlying question. See, the thing is, the fashion of the 50s and early 60s tended to move towards variants of Datejusts and day dates. They were the true aspirational pieces from the family. Precious metals were also in high demand at the time. So these newer sports dress models that arrived did not influence the masses, in the beginning at least. Here is another question. Did Rolex at the time possibly think about creating a Datejust styled watch that could incorporate a GMT function? Would that design not have fitted the time period, but also emphasized that image of luxury better, as passengers took to the skies for the first time? Food for thought. And I have a theory that a design like this was thought about, planned and devised, but there were restrictions. Technologically, at the time, it was not feasible. The complication required would cost a lot of money to manufacture. The size of the piece would reduce legibility of the separate time zone dial, if that was a plan that they might have had in mind. Maybe at the time, they were considering to produce what would later become the modern tonograph, with a fluted bezel, inset numerals. This, of course, is a prediction. There is no clear route to explain if this was ever finalized, but at the time, Rolex had produced some marvelous pieces, like annual calendars. So it's not completely unbelievable to consider that the family were toying with this idea to create a watch in a 36mm format that could determine the time in a different time zone. So instead, the more legible, iconic Pepsi GMT and the myriad of other color options arrived over time and pushed the Rolex GMT into the camp of being one of the best complications the family has ever made, then and since. It came as a surprise then, many decades later, when Rolex decided to produce their most complicated modern watch to date, blending a top-tier dress piece, like the day date, with a GMT complication, in a similar way to how the Sea-Dweller became the more technical variant of the Submariner. The Sky-Dweller, as it was named, was positioned as the more advanced GMT in the family. And since its introduction, it has received mixed reactions, but the unanimous agreement is that the concept, and the proof of concept, is absolutely brilliant. What makes the watch so compelling is that, even though the formula for the piece is new, it still possesses all of the quintessential Rolex DNA. Believe it or not, creatively speaking, it is hard for many companies to achieve this. The simple act of being able to introduce a new design, a new approach, and keep the formula the same shows a great level of understanding, but also restraint. It shows that the family understands their brand, and you would not believe how hard it is to pull off at times. In any creative department, there is always a push to change a formula when a new piece of property is introduced. There is this drive to try and push the boundary and pave a new way forward, but Rolex is the master of restraint. Some may chalk it up to laziness, others may say that it's just because they put little thought into the external components, but in reality, they kept what needed to remain simple, the same, and focused on what mattered, the dial and the complication. Hours, minutes, seconds, date, month, and a separate time zone. It is an annual calendar with a GMT complication. We've seen this blend of complications on other watches before, but not executed this way. We've seen how some watches require a set of pinholes for pushers to adjust the complications on the fly, not with this watch. If there is anything you can take away from this video, don't regard the aesthetics so much as just the sheer amount of attention to detail the movement has received. It is the true undisclosed marvel of this watch. The fluted bezel is rotated while the crown is pulled to its various positions that allows you to micromanage the complications. Once everything is set, you are ready to go. Strap it on and never take it off. So before addressing the dial design, it may be a good idea to try and categorize this piece and its position on the scale, lying between the more functional sports watch like the GMT and the more dress sports watch like the day-date. I believe that the Sky-Dweller has managed to place itself in that perfect in-between position. It is quite literally what Rolex was going for with this piece, because it shares both complications fairly well, sans the day complication. Having the date and the month is good enough, and how these complications have been executed will be addressed when we look at the dial closer. Fitting so many complications on a dial is a challenge. We would expect to see a series of subdials, spaced either symmetrically or asymmetrically on the face, but here, in its latest configuration, the Sky-Dweller again shows sparsity in a way. Granted, the earlier models with the white GMT wheel on the dial felt quite jarring. It was difficult to separate the face from the subdial at a glance, but the way the newer dials have been set with a matching wheel makes the piece look more integrated. There are many options to choose from in the Sky-Dweller family: solid gold, two-tone, steel. Each option has so many different dial variations. So the opportunities to find the model that suits your taste is pretty easy once you've made a decision to choose one. It really all depends on your preference. Two-tone is a more traditional look that suits the watch, since it adopts the date-just aesthetic. But for the more casual wearing watch, the option of a black, blue or white dial would help tone down the wearing experience. To the actual layout on the dial, it's all good and well having these complications on the dial, but unless it's easy to read at a glance, the complications can just get in the way of its core function. How easy is it to read the dial at a glance? Surprisingly very easy, depending on the numeral layout chosen on the dial, whether you opt for batons, Romans or Arabics, they all play their part differently. Since we generally look at the functional nature of things on this page, the simple baton layout would probably make the easiest reading experience. But what is interesting is that each dial choice sort of dictates what kind of watch you are looking for. One that is more functional or one that is more fashion-focused. We'll get to that in a second. There are elements that improve the reading experience, and one of the major changes to the handset makes reading the dial and the separate time zone easier. And if not for anything else, the skeletonizing of the hour and the minute hand lessens the visual weight of the hands on the dial. Small additions like the red surrounded triangle underneath the Rolex name makes seeing the separate time zone easier. And then of course, we cannot talk about this watch without discussing the brilliance that is the month indicator. The best designs are sometimes the most obvious choices. And after seeing how each hour plot corresponds to each month of the year, it is simply brilliant. It visually communicates the complication in such a subtle way, and it is one of the watch's greatest achievements. All of the separate elements, though different, some may say, that have a different design language, come together into a phenomenal package. There really isn't much needed to be said about it, but of course, this watch does deserve some criticisms. The size is one point. Is 42mm an acceptable size of a watch? In that, I mean, does it not make the piece look excessive on the wrist? We can understand why it was done for a few reasons. The added size makes the dial more legible at a glance, and for that reason is very practical. But the larger size does also make it noisy, maybe even oversized on a smaller wrist. Adding to that, the next aspect is also subjective, but the quote-unquote bling factor. Because of its larger than average size, with an equally larger fluted bezel, the piece does seem to scream about its presence in situations. Again, kind of a double-edged sword, because the Sky-Dweller is the king of complications in the Rolex family, and deserves to be assertive for that reason. But a larger bezel of this kind can be hit and miss for some people. There was something beautiful about the constrained approach taken with vintage fluted bezels, where they were present, but didn't need to shout about their existence. But I digress. The larger bezel design is a part of modern Rolex's DNA, and is a functional element that does need to be turned when adjusting the complications. We can also address the amount of text used on the dial. 4 lines may be quite excessive, but it does seem to balance out well in the space it's been allocated. And there is something really clean about how the coronet and the Rolex name has been set on the dial. One last comment that a viewer of this channel has highlighted is that the Cyclops lens at the 3 o'clock position partially magnifies the GMT dial and clutters up the clean lines. Very interesting point, and it would be nice if any of you could confirm this as a flaw that you've found. It makes you wonder whether or not the watch would work without a Cyclops lens. So, as far as introductions go, bringing in an entirely new model, showing off a new approach, an entirely new complication, Rolex hit it out of the park with the Sky-Dweller. That in part is due to just how well the watch works as an everyday wearer, how it is capable of operating so flawlessly while still remaining waterproof and rugged as any true Rolex should be. But ultimately, and this is important, how it has been able to keep all of the quintessential DNA of the brand contained in one piece. Very much a time capsule of their classic design motifs. I would even go out on a limb and say that it does it more than so many other pieces that the family has produced. It is a watch that not only pays homage to those old-timey, nostalgic photographs of classic aviation-inspired time zoners, but captures elements of Rolex's past roots, while still innovating and reinventing itself in the process. It is then, for all intents and purposes, a time capsule, a masterclass, a watch built to take on the vastness of the sky and remain there.